A chart that shows you kind of the gender inequality that still goes on in journalism in the United States, and sort of the different aspects where you can see, men receiving still the majority of, bylines or credit in print or on television in each of these different areas. Broadcast news in the evening, 68% men. Print journalists still have 62% of the bylines are men. Internet is a little bit more equal, 58%, and then wire services. So we still have a ways to go before there's sort of gender parity, but these numbers have actually improved over the last couple of years. This is just a chart that shows you, these are the major kind of publications in U.S. Newspapers, and shows you again some of that disparity all the way up from the New York Times down to the Chicago Sun-Times. One of the major things too that's going on in journalism right now in the U.S. is that we're losing newspapers a lot. These are kind of the major newspapers in the country, but it used to be that cities would have 2 or 3 newspapers for a major city. Now some cities are just down to 1, and even the 1 is mostly supplemented with wire reporting. They don't have their own staff covering a lot of things. So the newspaper industry in general is sort of suffering in the United States, where more and more people are kind of turning to online resources, and the newspapers haven't really been able to figure out a way to monetize what they do in print and translate that onto the internet. It's sort of it's been a struggling point, whereas news organizations that just start off as being online only seem to do a better job of producing an online product, rather than newspapers sort of with that old mentality, trying to translate that and make it mobile friendly and on the web. In U.S. politics, mostly men are covering that issue, whereas an issue, again, like culture or education is mostly women. So they're sort of typecast in a sense, as it comes to covering different areas in the news. You can see obviously the sports one, it has a huge disparity among women and men, and sports journalism is a hard thing for, and a lot of women are interested in it, but it's a hard thing for women to break into. Again, this is just a little chart that shows you kind of the areas, again, where women are more likely to write or report on issues like education, lifestyle, health, or religion, where the men are doing politics, criminal justice, science. International Women's Media Foundation, I know that does a lot and globally on issues of women in journalism. And in the United States, there's a couple of different organizations as well. There's like a Women's Press Foundation that does a lot of work. There's a couple of like Women's Media Research Center. Another big issue in the States is organizations that focus a lot on gender presence among people who are used as sources on the news, because a lot of times that comes up where you'll be reading an article and the only people that are quoted are men, or you'll turn on the television show and the panel of experts are all men. So there's a couple of different organizations in the U.S. that are set up to kind of monitor that. There's one that has a funny name. It's called Gender Avenger, and it's set up so that, for example, the woman that started it was tired of, she went to a lot of different conferences and corporate events, and she was tired of going to these big events and having the panels be of all men. And so she started this website where you can go on, and if you're at a conference or you're watching something on TV and you see this, you send something in, and then they send out on Twitter and calling you out, like, shame on company X for only having 5 men on their panel. Women in politics, our big problem is not having, is not the reluctance to elect women to office in the U.S., because we do have this big disparity between the number of women in politics and men. There's only 20 out of the 100 U.S. senators that are women, and there's only 84 women out of 435 members of the House of so we're at like 19% in both houses. But the biggest problem in the U.S. for having more women and more equality and more balance is women don't want to run for office.
It's terribly hard.
It's because they have this perception that they're not going to be treated fairly, that they have to be better than a man, they have to be overqualified, they don't think they have the qualifications, and then it's such a nasty existence, and so they don't want to run. And in order to get women to run, and there's been studies about this, one of the biggest and most effective ways is to actually recruit them. So, women, there was a study that was done of women in the state legislatures, and they were asked, what made you decide to run for office? And I think 53% of them, the women said they were recruited to run, meaning, somebody else in the legislature or someone in their community or a political party basically said, hey, we think you'd be great, please run. We'll support you, we'll help you. And then men were asked that same question, and I think it was only 20% of the men said that they were recruited to run. 50-something% of them said it was their own idea. But women, women need that extra pull in order to be convinced to run for office. And men, it's the same thing with jobs. Did you guys, do you know who Sheryl Sandberg is? She's the head of Facebook, and she wrote Lean In, about women in the workplace. And one of the studies in there that she quotes is about men and women applying to jobs, where men will apply for a job when they think that they meet probably 60% of the qualifications. And women will only apply for the job if they think they meet 100% of the qualifications. And so the same thing is happening right now in U.S. politics, is that women don't feel that they're qualified to run or they want to run. So our problem is actually recruiting and getting more women to run.
About quotas.
What's that?
Quotas.
Quotas? That's a good question, and they came up. I was just in Romania, in Bucharest, talking to women politicians there. And that's one of the things that they raised as a potential thing they're trying to get through Parliament, is a potential having quotas on the ballot. But I think there's two sides to that, right? I mean, I think the downside is, if you're setting aside spots for women to be in, then are you underestimating their ability if the only reason why they're there is because they're a woman? And so then do you undermine their power because they have to be there? And do you kind of lose respect for the women that are there, on one hand? And then, on the other hand, if you don't have quotas and if you don't see, numbers improving, how are you ever going to get women in those slots? I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I heard it's interesting. A few years ago, we had local elections.
Yeah.
There was a law, something about.
Her name is Anne-Marie Slaughter, and she was one of the top people in the State Department under Hillary Clinton. And she was expected, she was on track to really be a very high-level government official. And she had been a professor at Princeton University in New Jersey. And during the course of the time that she was in Washington working at the State Department, kind of working all the time, her husband was back in Princeton with their two sons, and he was what we call the default parent. So he was the one that if the kids got sick, he would deal with them. He was the one that if they needed to be picked up from school, he would deal with them. He was kind of there, and she would go home. She would go to Princeton on the weekends. It's like a 2-hour trip on the train, 2 or 3 hour trip. But most of the time she was in Washington, and she had this big high-powered job. And she up and decided one day that enough, like she couldn't do it anymore. Her kids were turning to be teenagers, and her son was having problems and getting into trouble here and there. And she was like, well, my family needs me. I'm leaving this big State Department job, and I'm going to go back to Princeton and just be a professor there. And she wrote an article about it, and it was called Why Women Can't Have It All. It was in a publication called The Atlantic. It's probably the most downloaded and discussed story in The Atlantic in the history of the magazine, which is like 50 years old. And it started a huge conversation in the United States about this very issue of women. And because the article she wrote she said she was very highly criticized among other women who were professionals for getting out of the workforce, for sort of saying enough, I can't do it, and really saying women can't have it all. We just can't do it all, and there's times when you have to sort of get off of that treadmill and take care of what you have to take care of. And there was a lot of feminists in the United States that came out very much against her and saying she was a sellout. And anyway, it sparked a huge debate. And then she later wrote a book, I can't remember the name of it, but I actually did an interview with her for a magazine that I was working for. And the basic point of her book was that until we as a society learn to put a value on caregiving and value it as much as breadwinning, bringing home money, that we're going to always have this disparity among genders in the United States, and men are never going to be seen as, want to be caregivers and be the default parent if we don't value it as much as we do as breadwinning. And so that was her point in the book, is that we still have this, society where we place more of a value on working than actually providing care for either children or for elderly parents. And anyway, it's a big debate in the United States, but if you're interested, her name's Anne-Marie Slaughter, and the article is in the Atlantic magazine, you can Google it. But it's an interesting read about kind of all these issues about women in the workplace and